So the first social institution that we're going to start with is family. And it makes sense. Once you understand what the family is supposed to do, then it makes sense that that's the place where we start. And what we'll talk about are some of the trends that sociologists might be interested in studying if you're trying to understand a society. Either you are thinking about any society that you've never come across and you want to understand how they're operating or how they're sustaining themselves or how are they being stable one way or the other, you look at these social institutions. Or if by chance, you and 100 people, 100 strangers showed up at an intersection one day, said, let's form a new society, then, you have to decide how are you going to meet these challenges. As a social institution, the first one that you come up with is family. Remember, if you haven't watched that video on social institutions, or if you don't understand what they are in their sort of the framework of them for society, then it would be a good time to double check that, because that's the frame that I want you to keep. The family as a social institution is a socially recognized group of individuals who may be joined by blood, marriage, or adoption, and who form an emotional connection and an economic unit of society. Blood, marriage, or adoption. That's how this group gets together. And they have two essential functions. One is to take care of one another emotionally, and the other one is to take care of one another economically. We'll talk about economics later, but the thing to think about now is economics essentially is just making sure that everybody gets what they need. So that's what the family does. And it said, you get together by virtue of blood, marriage, or adoption. So the first thing that I want to talk about when we're talking about family is marriage, because historically, traditionally, that's the way a new family is formed, right? A marriage is a legally recognized social construct between two people, traditionally based in a sexual relationship and implying a permanence of the union. That's a really, again, like convoluted definition for something that you already know. Two people, typically male, typically female, two typically male, female bodies get together and essentially answer the call to society and say, we are going to answer the call. Like, that's what we're going to do. We're going to do what we need to do to make sure that society sustains itself. We're going to make babies. Again, based in that sexual relationship. Two bodies come together, and that interaction is that sexual activity. The outcome of that sexual activity is have babies. And then when we have these babies, we're going to take care of them and one another emotionally, and we're going to take care of them and one another economically. The thing that's important about marriage, when I say that this is the thing that, we've traditionally done or historically done, is that marriage is a legally recognized social contract. Because two people can have sexual interactions, for instance, and we have no social expectations of them to continue to care for one another emotionally or continue to care for one another economically. Marriage says that's what we're going to do. We're going to have these sexual relations. We're going to answer the call to take care of the emotions and the economics. And there's an implication of the permanence of that union. Now, what's important about that even is the point that it's legal. We said very early that societies will organize themselves based on that culture. It's a shared culture within a particular boundary or territory. In that list of cultural elements, we talk about norms all the time. Some of those norms are informal, just generally what we expect of one another. For instance, we expect that sexual activities happen in between two adults, for instance, who hopefully care about each other. But some of those things are important enough that we formalize them. We turn them into laws. So marriage is how we legally recognize essentially two people who come together for the purposes of those sexual relations, essentially to have babies, care for one another emotionally, and care for one another economically. That's what marriage is in a society. Important enough for our society for us to sort of define what that is, what that looks like, and figure out who's going to do it. And it's a mechanism of social control. We say that as a society, the social institution of a family, for the most part, should be created by people who get together, who get married, who make this promise. And so we create the law to control the way that that happens, and essentially to maintain the order of things, to avoid the opposite of order, which is chaos, right? So marriage is one of those ways we generally find family. What that definition said is marriage, blood, or adoption. So the other distinction right away to make is the family of procreation and the family of origin. The family of origin is the family that you are born into, right? You're born to a set of parents. That's your blood relationship. Again, family either by marriage or by blood or by adoption. Your family of origin could be the family that you are adopted into. It's not the family you were born to, but that becomes essentially your original family, because the family of procreation is the family that you create when you answer the call to procreate, have kids, take care of them, economically, right? So we make these distinctions sociologically because if we want to talk about which family, which family are we talking about, that distinction is one of the first ones to make. So the terms that we tend to hear when we're talking about marriage or family end in this GAMY. So you are familiar with the terms of monogamy and polygamy. Monogamy is essentially a person marrying one other person, mono, one, right? A marriage that unites two partners because that's one person marrying another person. That's typically the kind of marital unit that you see in a society. Polygamy is one person marrying multiple people. So one person marrying two partners or more than two partners. And polygamy is, again, sometimes legally acceptable in a particular society. But the thing to remember about polygamy is that definition of marriage and family. It's the idea that what you're going to do is take care of not just the emotional needs of one another, but the economic needs of one another. So even if you have a society that recognizes legally polygamy as a marital type that is legally recognized, which means it gets all the benefits and privileges and expectations or responsibilities, you still find that people will choose to be united in monogamous relationships. And the reason why is that if I were the man in that household, for instance, and I live in a society where traditionally I'm the protector and the breadwinner, then it's easier for me to support economically one family instead of a family with multiple wives with multiple children, right? So even in societies where polygamy is a recognized legal marital unit, you still find that most people choose to be monogamous. Because once you enter that call and you take on a second wife or a third wife or a fourth wife, for instance, then you are telling society, don't worry, I got it. Like, we are doing this together. I'm taking care of these emotional needs for these units, and all of them together, I'll take care of those economic needs. And so when you have that legal recognition, you also have the expectation legally to fulfill that order. These is this We are a monogamous society in the United States, and that's so particularly important to our legal system, or the way that we recognize families or marriages in our society. Bigamy is against the law. It's a felony. Again, law means that it was a construct that was important enough to us and our cultural norms that we needed to write it down and decide what the confines of it were, legally, what that means. Bigamy is entering a new marriage while already married to someone. And so we don't allow that. And we so don't want you to do that, that it's against the law to do it. So remember, these formal laws are our ways to retain some control over how society is operating one way or the other. And so we create the law that says this is how we're going to accept it, and this is how we're not going to accept it. I was about to erase that, but I'll just go over here. Sometimes those expectations are legal, and sometimes they are sort of informal. So another set of these terms with the GAMY that's important to think about is endogamy and exogamy. Endogamy is the marriage of people in the same social category. So when you're thinking about race, ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic status, age group, that is when two people come together in marriage and they share the same social category or categories. Exogamy is the opposite of that. It's the marriage of people in different social categories. And the concept here is important, especially along that lines as to what is legal and what is not legal, versus what is informally expected for society based on those cultural values, and then sometimes based in religion. For instance, it is not illegal for an interracial couple to get married. It used to be a Black man could not marry a white woman until I think like the late 1960s. For two races to be married in an interracial couple, that would be exogamous because they are based on race from two different social categories. It used to be illegal to do that. Those kind of exogamous marriages were against the law. It is no longer against the law. It is still exogamous because there's still two people of different races marrying, but it's no longer illegal. Endogamous, when people are of the same race, for instance, or of the same ethnicity, again, clearly we haven't had any rules that said that's illegal, but sometimes we do have some social and cultural expectations that that's what we're going to see. So even though interracial relationships or exogamous relationships based on race is no longer against the law, we still sometimes maintain an endogamous expectation of people. We certainly have some expectation of that in terms of age, this thing of a super old man marrying a super young girl or a young lady, not against the law. It is exogamous, so nothing's going to stop them from doing it. But we generally expect for people to marry endogamously based on age. Somebody in their 20s married somebody in their 20s, or, if there's a difference in age, that it's not going to be drastic. One of those biggest debates is the endogamous relationships based on gender. It used to be also until very recently that the endogamous relationships between gender were legally not allowed to be a marital recognized union legally. Part of that question is, well, what is the purpose of a family? If the purpose of the family is to answer the call to have some babies, then you don't get same gender relationships having babies or same sex bodies don't reproduce in that way. The counter to that is, well, there's some heterosexual couples, for instance, of different genders who are not having babies. And then the larger question is, well, do you have to reproduce because you can have a family by adoption, right? Do you have to reproduce? No. And more than that, can you provide emotional connection for one another and take care of one another in that way, and to take care of one another economically in that way? Then you have to really think about, what is a family then? And can people who share the same gender or share the same sex take care of those family institutional needs? And so the question is, are you going to have unions like that? And what kinds of expectations do we have of you as a society? And whether or not we should expect that and allow that illegally, so that you also have kind of the protections that come along with doing so. So whether something is legal or not legal is certainly a question in terms of whether we recognize that marriage or not socially and legally. But sometimes we might recognize something as legal and still have some social opinions about it. So this is where I want to stop this video. I will start the next video on how we sort of make some distinctions of who is actually in a family.